there is literally one metric that you need to focus on in sales and business in general. And if you keep your eyes on this metric, if you optimize everything around this metric, you will make more money, right? And it's not the metric that you might think. Now, most people would think close rate, right? Close more deals. And that is a massive part of this, but it is just a part of the larger umbrella that is this metric that we need to be optimizing for. And in this video, I'm going to tell you exactly how to get the most juice, squeeze the most juice possible out of this and make the most money possible as soon as possible. So if you're wondering who I am, my name's Oliver. I have closed hundreds of thousands of dollars in deals for a info product agency, and I've also worked in sales for 5 years. So I like to think I know a thing or two about closing deals. I make these videos to make your life easier because I have suffered through the trials and tribulations that come from not knowing these things and figuring it out as you go. So what is this number one metric that we need to be focusing on? It is cash collected. Voila. And you're probably thinking like, okay, that is super obvious. Obviously, I just want to be making more money. I need to be getting more money off people. But a lot of people focus very heavily on the close rate instead of looking at cash collected. And this is a massive, massive mistake. And I'll give you two examples. I do have some scenarios later in this video that I'm going to run you through. They're going to show you exactly how big of a difference optimizing for cash collected can have on the business and tweaking a few different things. But for now, we'll just go with one really simple example to illustrate it. So you've got two scenarios. Scenario one, you take 100 calls. Scenario two, you take 100 calls. In scenario one, you close 20 deals and each one is worth 1,000. And in scenario two, you close one deal and it's worth 30,000. Now, the obvious answer here is scenario two was better, right? Even though you only closed 1% of those 100 calls, you made 50% more money. So this is what we would want to do more of, right? It'd be better to do another 100 calls and do the same thing over again than to revert to making 1,000 20 times and closing at 20%. So we need to be focusing on cash collected. Now, the ideal scenario would be that we close 20 and they're all 20 or 30k deals, right? So we're optimizing for cash collected and for the close rate. But the first thing we need to be thinking about is cash collected, total cash collected. And total cash collected is call volume multiplied by your close rate multiplied by the average cash collected. It's that simple. And you can increase the total cash collected you make in a business every single month, aka just money in your bank account, how much money you actually make, not deal value or contract size, not like we made 100k this month, but that's just, the contract size and we only collected 10k. I'm talking actual money in your bank account. There's only three things: the volume of calls you take, the percentage of those calls that you close, and the average amount of money you collect on each one of those closes. And if you tweak any one of these numbers, you're going to make more money. The secret, the source that you're here for, is that you should be tweaking all of them at the same time. You should be taking as many calls as possible. You should be closing as many of those, and you should be collecting as much cash as possible from each one of those closes. So the first thing that I'm thinking about when I look at a business and when I look at like the sales process is how many calls are we taking, right? Because we don't need to improve anyone's skills to make more money if we just take more calls. It's pretty obvious, right? Like increasing the close rate, that requires skill. Increasing the cash collected, that also requires skill. There's some other things that go into it, but let's just say it also requires skill. Volume, anybody can do more volume, right? You could get somebody else doing the same amount of volume. You could hire another person doing another 100 calls and have more volume. You could have the same person do more calls, that's more volume. They don't need to get any better. They just need to take more calls and they will close more deals. If they take 50% more calls, they will close 50% more deals. In theory, obviously this is a hypothetical scenario, but you get the idea, right? So call volume is the number one thing, and there's loads of things you can do to improve call volume, including hire someone. There's also some things you can do on an individual level to improve call volume. Obviously, if you're running ads or doing outbound and stuff like that, you could ramp that up and book more calls. But even if you've got somebody with a full calendar, or even if your calendar's full, you can still increase call volume by doing some fancy little things that I have implemented in the business that I'm in now that have had a massive impact on us taking more calls. So call volume is the first thing you want to focus on. Once you've got past that, now we're going to look at the close rate. The cool thing as well is that the more calls you take, again, this is not an exact science, But if you take more calls, you'll get more practice. And if you get more practice, you'll get better, provided that you are being deliberate in the way that you're doing the calls and in the way that you're like getting feedback on the calls and if you're reviewing the calls and everything like that. Basically, if you get more reps in, you'll get better. The rep that does 1,000 calls in a year versus the rep that does 100 calls in a year gets better. That's a fact. Now, we can specifically look at close rate too, right? So let's just take those two scenarios from earlier. I'll just take another two scenarios. Obviously, the guy who closes 20% versus the guy who closes 10% over the same number of calls probably is the better closer in regards to just straight up persuasion. But this is, of course, not including cash collected. So the ideal scenario would be that we're taking more calls and we're closing a higher percentage of these calls. And then finally, we are collecting more cash on average. Now, this is a really big one because, again, if we just go back to our ridiculous scenario, like the person who makes the most cash is the best at closing deal, or is the best closer, is the best person to have in the business. Better to have somebody who closes 1% of their deals and makes more money than the guy who closes 20% of their deals. So we want to be looking at all three of these at all times to be making sure we're making the most money possible. We want to be taking extra calls, closing more of those calls, and increasing how much cash we collect on each one of those. I have illustrated these examples down here, and you can see that really small changes make a massive, massive difference. So in scenario one, you've got 100 calls that have been taken by whoever, right? The close rate is 20%, the average cash collected is 1k, total cash collected 20k. Very, very simple, right? In the other scenario, we've got call volume as 110. It's only 10% more, right? I didn't write that down, but just it is. It's 10% more. 110 versus 100 is 10%. The close rate has gone from 20 to 25%, which is a 25% increase. It's nothing crazy. I mean, it's 25% relative increase, that is. It's nothing insane. 25% close rate is not particularly impressive. Depends what you're selling, but it's not particularly impressive. If you're already at 20%, you can almost certainly get to 25%. Average cash collected, we've increased it by 20% from 1 to 1.2. Really small difference. So we're taking 10% more calls, we're closing 25% more of those calls, and we're collecting 20% extra cash. That results in a 65% increase in cash collected over a month. And that is the difference between 20k and 33k. That is a massive, massive difference. That is an extra $13,000 right there in value every single month being generated from a very small array of tweaks that you can make to the process. And honestly, stuff like this, just looking at these things, keeping it really simple, looking at the call volume, looking at the close rate, looking at the average cash collected, and just seeing, okay, how can we take more calls? How can we close more calls? How can we collect more cash? Just thinking about it in that order when you're looking at it and looking at the business, just doing a few little things can result in massive changes. Bear in mind, imagine you increase the call volume by 50%, the close rate by 30%, the cash collected, imagine if you doubled that. I mean, just doubling the cash collected in this example alone would have doubled the business. So when you can start to see how some crazy changes start to happen within a business when you start making fairly significant but nothing mental changes to these numbers. So yeah, if you want to make more money, you've got to optimize for cash collected, and the way to do that is to take more calls, to close more of them, and to collect more per close. And that is that. Hope you enjoyed.